listener production.
Hey, Chris Spyrou with you. Welcome to The Briefing. Horrific stories and images are continuing to emerge from protests in Iran, which started out as anti-inflation marches in the capital Tehran, but have since turned deadly with 650 people killed.
In previous protests, they'd used rubber bullets, they'd used tear gas, they'd used water cannon and other crowd control methods. Now we're just seeing military-grade weapons, we're seeing live fire, we're seeing people literally shot in the streets.
The latest on the protests in Iran and an explainer on the movement is coming up in the second half of this episode. First, though, let's get into the headlines with Sasha Barbagat. It's Tuesday, the 13th of January.
Anthony Albanese is already facing pushback against his suite of reforms to be announced today in the wake of the Bondi terror attack. The Prime Minister yesterday announced he'd be recalling Parliament early, first to hear condolence motions next Monday for the 15 victims of the December 14 tragedy, before a debate on the new laws on Tuesday. Now, the Coalition was briefed late yesterday on these new laws, which will include tougher penalties for hate speech and racial vilification, including a crackdown on so-called hate preachers, creating a new racial vilification offence, as well as making it easier to cancel visas. They will also include a gun buyback scheme. Albanese saying he wants to get the new legislation passed next Tuesday.
The bill is the Combating Anti-Semitism, Hate and Extremism Bill. It's a comprehensive package of reforms which creates serious offences for hate preachers and leaders seeking to radicalise young Australians.
Opposition leader Susan Lee is already mounting criticisms of the new laws, saying it's unreasonable for a single bill to cover such a range of, quote, complex and unrelated policy areas. The Coalition is also raising issue with one section of the reforms that would exempt preachers who quote or reference a religious text for the purpose of religious teaching or discussion, viewing it as a loophole for hate preachers to continue spreading anti-Semitic messaging. The opposition's Home Affairs spokesperson John O'Duniam says they'll review the legislation closely before deciding whether to support it.
We reserve our right, of course, to make any amendments necessary to ensure that we do get the balance right, that we do avoid unintended consequences, and that we get the right outcome for the Australians who want this Parliament to do the right thing.
Meantime, the Northern Territory government has rejected the federal government's gun buyback proposal after the PM asked the states to help foot the bill. The scheme, which will be the biggest since the Port Arthur massacre, would require the states and territories to go 50-50 with the federal government in funding it, and also have them run the collection, processing and payment to individuals for surrendered guns, Chris.
Yeah, and we did hear from the NT's Chief Minister, Leah Finocchiaro, yesterday. She said her government will not support the buyback if the Territory had to partly pay for it. Now, the provisions for the buyback, including how to fund it, will make up part of the Omnibus Bill to be debated in Canberra next week.
Yeah, and the other issue the Coalition is going to be facing, Chris, is around balancing the needs of wanting to have strong action on gun reform with its voters who, you know, national voters. A lot of them are farmers. They live in regional communities and on properties, and they use guns to do their work and to run their properties. And part of these gun reforms include limiting people to only owning 4. And, you know, there are a lot of farmers who are coming out to say, well, you know, we don't agree with that. And so then the Coalition's really going to struggle to go, well, how do we balance this?
Yeah.
And speaking of balance as well, it's worth noting Muslim groups say about these racial vilification laws and the hate speech laws that they have not been consulted on them, but the government's confirmed that they did consult the Jewish community on these, and there is a real concern within the Muslim community about Islamophobia and a rise in that again. We saw a highly respected imam and his wife attacked in Melbourne yesterday, and I think, you know, there's this fear that we may be going too far to one side. So I think there's a lot of voices that will want to be heard as we look to debate these new laws.
A cattle farmer whose wife managed to safely flee the Longwood bushfire in central Victoria has been named as the person killed in the blaze. Max Hobson's remains were found about 100 metres from a burnt-out vehicle near Seymour, north of Melbourne, the first death linked to the state's ongoing bushfire disaster. He and his wife operated a cattle farm after coming to the profession later in his life, having worked as a mechanical engineer for 50 years before that. His age has not been revealed.
Yeah, and the identification of Max comes as locals impacted by multiple blazes across Victoria start returning to their communities to assess the damage. More than 350 buildings have been destroyed and 1,000 agricultural properties impacted. while livestock losses are estimated to be over 15,000, which is just so devastating for these communities, Chris. And at the time of recording this morning, there are 12 fires right across Victoria continuing to burn at watch and act level. And you can stay up to date via the Vic Emergency website and app if you are in any of those areas. Now, it's interesting hearing members of the CFA, the Country Fire Authority, coming out to talk about these fires, Chris, because Victorians and Australians more broadly would remember the 2009 Black Saturday bushfires. 173 people were killed. Absolutely devastating. The worst bushfire disaster seen in this country. And fireys who have fought in both blazes say that these ones, particularly the Longwood fire, which is where that fatality occurred, are appearing more intense than even the Black Saturday fires and burning structures that wouldn't ordinarily be affected. So, yeah, some really harrowing stories coming out of Victoria at the moment.
Jacinda Ardern has become the latest international headliner to pull out of this year's Adelaide Writers' Week over the board's decision to pull Palestinian-Australian academic Randa Abdel Fattah from its lineup. The former Prime Minister of New Zealand joins a growing list of writers and commentators who have decided to boycott the event over the decision. And while reports are mixed as to the exact number, it's believed more than 100 authors have pulled out, including Trent Dalton, Hannah Ferguson and Peter Grester.
It's another blow for organisers. This comes after its chair and several board members resigned yesterday. A sponsor withdrew its support and former leaders of the festival joined to sign an open letter calling on Abdel Fattah to be reinstated, with some noting the future of the event now really hangs in the balance. After the board announced its decision to drop her from the lineup due to concern over, quote, cultural sensitivity in the wake of the Bondi terror attack last week, we got a new statement yesterday saying organisers were navigating a complex and unprecedented moment and will be sharing updates as soon as possible, Chris. And as we mentioned yesterday, there's no schedule for the Writers' Week currently on the website because so many of its event speakers have boycotted the event. What are they going to do? Who knows? Will they cancel it? I mean, I think there's a real chance that could happen.
Malaysia and Indonesia have become the world's first countries to block Elon Musk's chatbot Grok over its ability to produce sexually explicit deepfakes. The AI tool allows users to generate images and has recently been used to edit images of real people to show them in revealing outfits, with the Southeast Asian countries saying it could be used to produce pornographic and non-consensual images involving women and children.
This comes as pressure is growing elsewhere for Grok to be blocked, especially in the UK, where authorities have launched an investigation into whether or not it is breaching local laws. Similar investigations have been launched here in Australia by the eSafety Commission, which has bipartisan backing.
The use of generative artificial intelligence to exploit or sexualise people without their consent is abhorrent. I know that the eSafety Commissioner is looking at this.
That was Anthony Albanese speaking there. Now, those investigations in the UK have been slammed by Elon Musk, unsurprisingly, who has accused the government of wanting to suppress free speech. Similar arguments are being made by ex-users over the Australian government's probe as well.
Yeah, which is an argument I really don't understand. I tend to scroll Twitter to understand different perspectives and stuff like that. I do think that is important, especially in this role, to kind of, get a big border, a cross-section of what's going on in the world. I don't understand how this is an attack on free speech. I don't understand how putting a photo forward of someone that you don't know, a celebrity or, a family member or even yourself, and asking an AI chatbot to undress you and have you half naked on a platform is something that is integral to democracy and free speech. It's a very odd argument being mounted there. But look, this isn't the first time Grok's landed itself in hot water. We do know last year there was this update that went forward that made Grok, unhinged or unfiltered. And Elon Musk said, they made it a little bit too compliant. But what came out of that was some horrific messaging around praising Hitler and these anti-Semitic comments. There was a lot of chatter in the US and the EU about how to put more restrictions on Grok at that time. It was partially blocked last year in Turkey after it produced offensive and insulting responses about the president. That was a partial ban. This is the first time we're seeing a full ban on Grok. And look, both governments say they have sent notices to the platform, but until such time as Grok stops blocking this thing from happening, they're not going to bring it back in the country.
And fresh off admitting neither of us are the biggest cricket fans, Chris. I understand the cultural relevance of the game. We're not the biggest fans, but there is some big cricket news today that we have to get across.
Yes, that's right. Elisa Healy, Australia's women's cricket captain, has called stumps on her playing career this morning, breaking the news on listeners' very own Willow Talk Cricket podcast, which she co-hosts with Adam Peacock and Brad Haddon.
No, look, it's been a long time coming. I think probably the last few years has been probably more mentally draining than anything else. A few injuries. You got to dive into the well a couple of times, and that well's getting less and less full of water, so getting harder to dive back in there.
Yeah, so a huge congratulations to Elisa. She is an absolute superstar of the sport. She's played nearly 300 matches for Australia, won 8 World Cups, holds all kinds of records as a wicketkeeper and batter. But she's not done yet. She will lead the Aussies in the series against India across February and March right here on home soil. She will have at least one superfan as well in the stands, her husband, Mitch Starc, who was named player of the series in Australia's Ashes win over England just last week. Listen to us with the cricket trivia. We know what we're talking about.
We do. And look, if you want to hear Healy's full retirement announcement, check out the Willow Talk podcast. We've popped a link to that in the show notes. And that is it for headlines for today. Coming up next is my deep dive looking into the latest with the protests in Iran, where they started from and where they're going. Stick around. That deep dive is coming up for you next. It's been more than 2 weeks since anti-government protests erupted across Iran. What started out as strikes and demonstrations by shopkeepers and merchants over rising inflation in Tehran's Grand Bazaar has turned into a national call to remove the country's supreme leader of more than 36 years, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. Protests have spread beyond the capital to multiple provinces, with crowds chanting slogans calling for his death, all the while the diaspora has been rallying in major cities across the globe, including in London, Berlin and Washington. In Iran, though, the internet's been largely turned off and phone lines cut as the regime continues its violent crackdown, reportedly killing hundreds of protesters and injuring hundreds more, whom authorities are labelling as the enemies of God. Now, Donald Trump has threatened to intervene, which is a threat the Islamic Republic has unsurprisingly not welcomed, warning retaliation against US and Israeli assets in the region. Dr. Kylie Moore-Gilbert is an expert in Middle Eastern politics who spent more than 2 years imprisoned in Iran by the Revolutionary Guard, and she joins me now. Kylie, before we get into the how, can you walk us through what's happening on the ground right now in Iran?
It's really hard to know what exactly is happening on the ground in Iran right now, because for the past 3 days, we've had an almost total internet blackout and communication blackout coming out of the country. What has dripped and filtered through has been really, really shocking. Images of bodies being unloaded from trucks onto the streets, into morgues, into courtyards of mosques and other places, families scrambling to identify their loved ones, mass protests in the street, people being fired upon by security forces with live rounds, with bullets, unarmed, innocent, peaceful protesters being fired upon by their own government. It's really, really shocking stuff.
And as we understand it, this started out as a protest in Tehran, in the country's capital, and those were business owners there protesting the country's economic situation. What can you tell us about that specifically before it became this nationwide protest?
Iran has been in the doldrums economically for really decades, but the last few years have been particularly severe. Inflation is off the scale. The cost of food, the cost of medicines, the cost of just living in Iran has gone up dramatically, particularly since the currency has plunged to a record low, and people just can't survive. The average ordinary Iranian is really struggling to just eke out a living and put food on the table. And we've also seen unprecedented numbers of people pushed below the poverty line in Iran because of the regime's policies. So this has led to widespread dissatisfaction, and the initial trigger for these protests were merchants in the bazaar and currency traders protesting the economic conditions.
Now, this isn't the first protest of its kind, essentially protesting the regime and its authoritarian leader. And it's also not the first time that the regime has violently cracked down on them or even shut off the internet for that matter. But what makes this one different to all those in the past?
I think there's a real sense of desperation now. You know, the protest movement of 2022, the War and Life Freedom movement, that mass widespread movement led by women following the killing in custody of Mahsa Amini in 2022, that was very much characterized by hope, in my opinion. You know, it was a really hopeful movement. Now people just seem desperate. They're desperate to remove this regime from power. And equally so, the security forces and the regime itself are desperate. We're seeing, you know, the mask very much has been taken off. In previous protests, they'd used rubber bullets, they'd used tear gas, they'd used water cannon and other crowd control methods, particularly in the early days prior to maybe trying to put down the protests brutally, which they eventually always did. Now we're just seeing military-grade weapons, we're seeing live fire, we're seeing people literally shot in the streets for protesting. So that desperation is on both sides, and it feels really existential this time. Obviously, the number of fatalities also far exceeds that of 2022, and also it seems 2019 as well, when they shot between 1,500 and 2,500 protesters in the streets then too. So it's really, really shocking stuff. I'm sure we'll have even worse footage and stories emerge when the internet is ultimately restored. And it's just of a scale that's unprecedented in recent memory in the Islamic Republic.
Geopolitically, do you think that's playing a role in what we're seeing unfold here? The economic situation is one thing, and also the humanitarian situation in Iran is another. But do you think there might be some people in Iran that are looking to what's going on in the globe at the moment with everything US, Venezuela, et cetera, and are almost feeling emboldened or somewhat empowered to do what they're doing?
I think there are some that take Donald Trump at his word, and he has released a few Truth Social posts, as well as made a statement to media in recent days saying if the Iranian regime fires on protesters in the streets, he will get involved. Now, obviously, they have been firing on protesters. What would Trump's involvement entail? We're not 100% sure. He said not boots on the ground, but does he mean a bombing campaign against regime targets? Does he mean assassinations? How would he get involved, and would that actually make anything better, or could it actually backfire and make things worse? It's a really dangerous game he's playing. There are some in Iran that are calling for that, but there are also many that think that, you know, this is their revolution, this is their uprising. Foreign intervention isn't the solution. And empower the Iranian people to get rid of their oppressors rather than come in and do it for them, particularly looking at what's happened in Venezuela with Maduro. They've just removed the guy at the top, but they've left the rest of the regime in place. And I think there are genuine fears in Iran that, you know, should the US do the same with Ayatollah Khamenei, for instance, who is 86 years old and isn't going to be around much longer anyway, will something even worse emerge and step into the vacuum in that eventuality?
How seriously are Trump's comments being taken by the regime at the moment? As I understand, they've said any US intervention will be met with retaliation against US and Israeli assets that are in the region. Are there other comments that are coming out of Iran at the moment that we should be taking stock of?
This is standard rhetoric for the Iranian regime. They threaten US military bases in the region. Obviously, they have a number of terrorist proxies in places like Iraq that are capable of mounting an attack on a US military base and have done in the past. They've also threatened to attack US shipping in the Persian Gulf. Now, obviously, that's a very sensitive area for oil shipments for a number of countries, and that would be a dramatic escalation. Now, whether or not they actually have the ability to carry out their threats is another matter. They're very vulnerable. They're very weak, particularly following that war with Israel of June of last year. And they've also lost a lot of their proxies in the region and the Assad regime in Syria, which also fell recently too. So they are exposed, they are weak. Obviously, they're making threats, but I think these threats are not necessarily going to give Donald Trump pause for thought.
Now, when we talk about a country like Iran, a lot of people forget that it's a country of over 90 million people. So there is by no means uniformity across this country in any sense of the word, in terms of culture, in terms of religion or political alignment. But what's support looking like for the regime at the moment?
If elections were to be held tomorrow, there's no way this regime would ever be returned to power. There's been a lot of reputable survey and demographic studies conducted from reputable organizations outside of Iran, looking into Iran with respondents inside the country, that have shown that roughly 10 to 15% of the population continues to support the Islamic Republic regime. And of that percentage, you can imagine some of them in a democratic election, if given a viable alternative, might not vote for the regime too, because it's just driven the country into the ground economically, culturally, socially. Iran is cut off from the rest of the world. This is a proud civilization with an incredible history, which has contributed so much to humanity in the past. And this Islamic Republic regime has really destroyed the livelihoods of its own people and wound back any progress that Iran had made in the decades prior to the revolution. So it's lost almost all the support of its own people, and it's clinging to power through violence and brutality rather than some kind of ideological cohesion.
And when you do talk about, the Iran pre-Islamic revolution, there's images that we see, and those images pop up all the time that Iran's in the headlines. It's the images of Iran from the 70s, especially women in the 70s. For someone listening who may be unfamiliar, can you explain to us very briefly what life was like in Iran pre-1979?
It's difficult to sort of wave a broad brush across what Iran was like because it was in the process of modernization. It wasn't a fully completed process. And as we saw in the 79 revolution, there was a sizable constituency of religious Iranians, people who might be from parts of the country, the periphery, small towns and villages, more deprived areas, outer suburbs of big cities, of the capital Tehran, for instance, for whom the modernization process essentially left them behind and they didn't see benefit from that. So that's one of the reasons why we saw the revolution happen in 79. It was that the pace of this transformation was perhaps too quick and too drastic, and not everybody was on board with it, in addition to some of the brutal and authoritarian practices of the Shah, which led people to call for democracy. Ultimately, they got something far worse. And I think that's why we're seeing nostalgia for the Shah and his regime, and some people calling for the return of his son, Reza Pahlavi, right now, is because in retrospect, in the 70s, say, life under the Shah was far superior for most Iranians than it is now, life under the Islamic Republic.
And he's someone whose name is being thrown around a lot at the moment, especially his calls to rise up and calling Iranians to take to the streets and join these protests. In your opinion, Kylie, do you think what we're witnessing now is the beginning of something new? Are we to expect a new Iran or the foundations of a new Iran? Or do you think what we're seeing now, unfortunately, is just another chapter in an incredibly, incredibly long and complex and bloody history that unfortunately may just not go anywhere?
I think this is going somewhere, but whether or not it's leading to a utopian democratic paradise, I'm not sure. I think revolutions are bloody and messy. Many of them fail. Many of them result in something worse than what was overthrown. And, the 79 one is an example of that. It depends on so many factors, including external factors, not just the internal politics of the Iranian opposition. Unfortunately, the opposition inside the country and in the diaspora is quite divided. There are a range of competing interests and a range of competing groups. And because of the brutality of the regime and its ability to quash any political organisation within the country outside of its own auspices, we haven't seen a viable opposition movement or a clearly defined political force emerge as a counterweight to the regime, which kind of leaves a vacuum. A number of people would love to step into that vacuum, and Reza Pahlavi is one, but it's going to be messy. I mean, if the regime was to disappear overnight magically somehow, what would it be replaced with? The most charitable and optimistic outlook would be some kind of transition to democratic elections. But what would happen to the old regime, particularly because they're the ones with the guns, they're the ones with the monopoly on violence? Even if the Ayatollah was to step down or die or disappear, you have a number of IRGC, Revolutionary Guard Corps generals and other very, very senior commanders who might be willing to continue to use violence. It's really hard to know, but we've seen that playbook, happen before in other revolutions too. So it's too early to say that this will lead to, some kind of democratic paradise. I think that the Iranian people want that. And fundamentally within Iran and in the diaspora, there's a yearning for democracy and for the people to finally have a say in who runs their country.
Kylie, thank you so much for making the time to chat to us on The Briefing.
Thanks for having me on.
That was Middle East expert Dr. Kylie Moore-Gilbert speaking with me there, and that is it for this episode of The Briefing. If you found this episode interesting or you learned something new, why not flick it over to a mate, and while you're there, leave us a rate and a review. I'm Spyrou. Catch you next time.